Hello, and welcome to another edition of Civil War Reflections with Brian Steele Wills. And we'll talk today, I think, about a subject that was one of the first individuals I spent time studying and that I wrote my first book about. That's Nathan Bedford Forrest, a character who was in many ways reflective of the ideals of an American frontiersman who rose from poverty to substantial wealth, but also who rose in the ranks from private to lieutenant general in the American Civil War, the war between the states, or the late unpleasantness. So Nathan Bedford Forrest is a character that embodies a lot of what the sort of self-reliant, independent kind of spirit of the American frontiersman or backcountryman prior to the war, and of course, in many ways also reflects some of the worst impulses of human nature. Not only was he prone to violent reactions himself, but involved in issues that at the time were still looked at as somewhat askance. He made his wealth predominantly through the slave trade, which even then was slave traders were looked down upon, certainly so today. And during the war, he's connected to the incident that becomes known as the Fort Pillow Massacre, which I've also written about separately, both as part of the biography of Forrest, but also separately. And after the war, he was one of the early leaders in the Ku Klux Klan. He did not found the Klan, but I say it found him. When it got big enough to need to have some leadership, he's the one who stepped forward to provide that leadership. So Forrest embodies the best and the worst in so many ways, and for that reason is an extraordinarily compelling individual. When I was first doing my doctoral dissertation at the University of Georgia, one of the things I had a professor who made the comment that Forrest was worse than Hitler, and I told that professor that that was letting Hitler off pretty easy, because while he does represent a lot of very negative aspects, both at the time and today as we look back and assess things from our judgment today, I always told my students in the classroom, and will tell you, that to try to study someone and understand them, you need to put yourself into their shoes, into their time frame, into their mindset. You can't be judgmental, although of course you could be, but it doesn't benefit you any. It might make you feel better, but it doesn't accomplish anything to try to understand why these people did and said and behaved the way that they did. But Forrest was born near the little village of Chapel Hill in Middle Tennessee on July 13th, 1821. He will only have minimal education, about 6 months of formal education, so that he did not really have a great command of the King's English. He tended to write as he spoke. He did so phonetically, so if fight is F-I-T-E in his mind, that's because it was fight. We're going to fight, and that's right, R-I-T-E. That would be how he would cut the letters down. Of course, he would look at that as making sense to him. So with that limited education, he nevertheless grew up and had to learn to be self-sufficient, especially once he lost his father early in his life. He had to assume the family's responsibilities at approximately age 16 when his father died. And of course, life in the southern backcountry back in those days reflected a lot of the kinds of issues that were pervasive regardless of your birth, but particularly true in the backcountry. The role of Southern honor being very important, very significant. Not so much, again, this sense of how you felt about yourself, but how you projected yourself to others. And so what people thought of you mattered greatly. If you were a man of your word, if you behaved in such a way that you showed that you could be counted on, those were valuable assets for a person to develop. And Forrest will develop those, even though he's always going to have an independent streak and a twist that's unique to himself. All throughout his life, he worked very hard to try to figure out how to control the world around him to the best of his ability. And he learned fairly early on that intimidation could accomplish the task of trying to control others, because you could get them to respond to you. You could, in essence, if you were talking about in a military sense, seize the initiative would require someone to react to you rather than you reacting to them. And in intimidating others, he would assert himself in such a way that that he could more or less dictate their responses to him or dictate their behavior towards him. But at any rate, he learned to be self-sufficient. He learned to be independent. He learned to be somewhat controlling of his environment as much as possible. And so he works hard in his early life, and he learned that one of the things he had to do was to move from the area of Middle Tennessee. The backcountry had moved westward, and in some ways he's going to move westward with it. As a young person, he'll go in his early, still in his early years, to Hernando, Mississippi, to go into business with an uncle. And at one point, there's a confrontation, a street confrontation with 4 different individuals, and Forrest is going to come out of the structure with his uncle, and the uncle is going to be struck down right away, and Forrest is left to fend against those 4 individuals by himself. And he manages to be able to do that, and wins a reputation for himself in his community, because again, if you follow the precepts of Southern honor, that your worth is dependent on what others think of you, by standing up to these individuals and showing his courage and fortitude and against greater numbers, he raised his stature in his community. He also learned early on that trading either in animals or in other types of commodities, that he could make money. And for that period of time, one of the forms of commodity, one of the forms of trading would be in slave trading. And he gets into that and begins to develop a significant amount of wealth, so that ultimately he is fairly well-to-do by the time of the war, by the time of the outbreak of the war. He has property on both sides of the Mississippi River. He has plantation property. He has slaves of his own, and of course had generated the largest part of that wealth through the slave trading business. So again, someone who looked at that as more of a practical measure than a moralistic measure. He did not try to explain that he was Christianizing people or that he was trying to do something to elevate those that somehow divinity had given your authority over. He looked at it as business, as practical, as part of the world, no different than if you traded in anything else. He will have minimal experience, military type of experience, by training with militia for a period of time, very brief period of time, and he serves as an alderman in Memphis just prior to the war. And one of the more famous stories is that there's an attempt to try to manipulate a business deal, and Forrest refuses to go along and threatens to dump anyone into the Mississippi River that wants to try to engage in shady dealings. So again, here's an individual that whatever you want to think about how he made his money, feels like he has standards, and the standards he has, he is not going to waver on. He's not going to let drop off in terms of, again, he's a man of his word, he's a man of integrity, etc., etc. So that's kind of how he approached things, again, regardless of what later generations or others might think about him. He is not a secessionist. At the time of the Civil War, he's busy with his property and his interests, and he's not engaged in the political effort to engage in what some people would talk about being fire eaters in places like South Carolina or Alabama. He's not into that sort of thing at all. And it's only after Tennessee's secession from the Union that Forrest decides to enlist. And he enlists as a private. I talked a few minutes ago about going into the military as a private and going all the way to lieutenant general. But his initial enlistment is as a private in Captain Josiah White's Tennessee Mounted Rifles, what later becomes the 7th Tennessee Cavalry. He also goes into the service with his youngest brother, Jeffrey, that he has tremendous affection and looks almost like a son for the way he views him, having raised him as a youth, and of course of his own 15-year-old son. So Forrest is gone into the ranks at the lowest echelons, but he has some friends in high places. His friendship with Governor Isham Harris is going to pay some dividends. He's going to be given the opportunity to raise his own unit. He's going to be ultimately able to take on a much higher rank very quickly. As a lieutenant colonel, Forrest is recruiting and equipping his own command using largely his own funds, his own money, at his own expense. And the first substantial combat experience that these individuals have is in Sacramento, Kentucky, in a running engagement in December 28th of 1861, in which he shows that he's willing to put himself at risk in harm's way, that he'll lead his men by example from the front. He's going to have that same spirit of, I don't ask you to go anywhere I'm not willing to go myself, and certainly characterizes his behavior throughout the war and until the end of the war. He engages the enemy personally. I mean, he often said war means fighting, and fighting means killing. War to the knife and knife to the hilt, and any number of other things that reflect this desire to, as he would say, forward men and mix with them. February 1862, he establishes a reputation for himself at Fort Donelson by taking his men out of the fort before surrender takes place. He had been engaged in a little bit more traditional kinds of roles for a cavalry officer. There's a number of historians that suggest that Forrest never really quite figures out how to behave in a way that's more systematic and more of the way in which, say, for instance, a James Ewell Brown Stewart or Jeb Stuart would behave. And he never really is going to be a Jeb Stuart. There's no question about that. But he does take some more of the traditional roles of screening and scouting. But again, you put him on a battlefield, don't expect him to stay inactive for any length of time. He's going to go ride to the front and try to get involved in the fighting. At the Battle of Shiloh, for instance, he's on one of the flanks, and he's supposed to be guarding that flank from a Union advance. And he says, boys, we're here guarding this little damn creek, and our friends are fighting. We're going to the sound of the guns. We're going to go to where the fighting is. And he moves forward to do that. So not exactly behaving the way he's supposed to behave. He's going to take the initiative. He's going to be an independent thinker. And that's just the Nathan Bedford Forrest you're going to get, whether you like it or not. In the battle of, or the fighting, I guess, is really probably the best way to characterize it. After Shiloh at Fallen Timbers, he's actually going to be wounded for one of the times in the war that he is, where he rides into the lines of William T. Sherman following the Confederate retreat. And he ends up outpacing his men to the point that they drop off and leave him by himself, rides into the lines where he's surrounded by Union forces that are trying to drag him from his horse, yelling, kill him, take him, etc. And he is actually wounded in the side, but then he picks a scrawny little Union fellow up off the ground and lifts him up and puts him behind him to act as a shield until he's out of harm's way. One of the more modern artists talked about how Forrest takes the hostage. He was not using the man as a hostage. He was using him to keep the fellow's friends, the bluecoats, from shooting at him as he rode back into his own lines. And he dumped him as soon as he was out of range. So he really wasn't trying to take a prisoner. He was trying to survive. He's not a good patient. Takes him a little while to recover, but then he gets back because he has a setback at one point from trying to come back too quickly. But then he does come back into service again as quickly as he can. Probably his first, really most significant military action is the capture of a substantial portion of the Union garrison at Murfreesboro, Tennessee, on his birthday, July 13th, in 1862. He'd been born in 1821. Here it is in 1862, when he's able to use bluff and bluster, which are two very common things for him, and convince different portions of a Union garrison that are divided to surrender, and then ultimately uses the surrender of one to play off against the other. In December 1862, he's going to cross the Tennessee River into the western part of the state of Tennessee on a raid that is going to be part of a cavalry operation that convinces Ulysses Grant that he really can't take on an overland approach to Vicksburg. Grant was trying to build up supplies and forces to think about moving along the roads and railroads to towards Jackson and then over to Vicksburg, and these raids stopped that cold, so that when people say that cavalry can't perform a strategic function, I think they're forgetting this. But Forrest is going to take out a lot of the rail lines behind the Tennessee River beyond, well, in front of Memphis. And so there's going to be a lot of wrecking of railroads and capturing of depots and so forth. And then he's going to turn and go across the Obion Bottoms and do some damage there before he ends up at a place called Parker's Crossroads. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the other cavalry operation was very effective in this combined effort was by Earl Van Dorn. Now, Van Dorn is not particularly adept at large military operations. His efforts at Pea Ridge and at Corinth are not going to go well. But as a cavalry raider, he was pretty good. And at Holly Springs, he takes out Grant's forward supply base at a lightning raid that does that, as Forrest is taking out the rail lines behind in Tennessee that are going to be the lines along which Grant could bring up additional supplies and rebuild his supply base. So between the two, it's going to thwart Ulysses Grant's first efforts at aiming at capturing Vicksburg. Forrest will elude his pursuers until December 31st, when at the Battle of Parker's Crossroads, he is got one force of Union troops pinned down, about ready to surrender, when a second force comes up behind him unexpectedly. He had tried to prepare for that force to show up, and his brother, who was generally pretty pretty capable and someone that Forrest could depend upon, got on the wrong road, and the federal force came in behind Forrest's lines. And the way that Forrest knew that they were there was the horse holders went racing past, and of course you never want that. The horses are being held in the rear in a safe area where theoretically you could then bring them up if you've got to pursue the enemy, or use them to get away if you have to fall back to them. But they're in a safe area. They were in an orchard that was supposed to have been behind the lines, and here they come racing by. And the way horse holders worked was that every 3 men would go forward while the 4th man would hold the 4 horses, or at least supervise the 4 horses until, again, they needed to remount. But Forrest is going to see that these folks are coming by, and they're in a disorganized fashion that shows that something's wrong. He goes to try to investigate, and supposedly comes on 2 Federals who calling him to surrender. And he's, according to one of the great stories, Forrest always seems to have great stories associated with him that, if they're not true, certainly reflect his character at the very least. And rather than being flummoxed, he says, "Well, boys, if you wait here, I'll go get the rest of my troops, and we'll all surrender to you." And I always joke when I tell that story that the 2 men are still standing there waiting for him to come back. But supposedly Forrest came back to his troops, said, "Boys, we're going to charge them both ways," which in essence was kind of what he had to do, was hold the force that he was trying to get to surrender in place while he stopped the advance of the other force, and then tried to slip out between. And as he looked at it, that meant that he had succeeded, that he had been victorious, that he was able to live to fight another day. He had certainly some very interesting ways of looking at success, at victory versus defeat. Well, he's going to be involved in other adventures, other fights, some that don't go well, as the second fight at Donelson near Dover that does not go well. He has a tendency to blame his superiors when things don't go well, which, again, you can say is not the most laudable characteristic in a soldier, but that's the human side of it for him. And he will have several commanders that he holds responsible for the kinds of setbacks that he is in a joint command with. So whether it's Major General Joseph Wheeler fighting Joe Wheeler, or later on other generals, of course, one of them was Van Dorn himself. But the sense of it was that again, Forrest was best as a raider. Braxton Bragg once made the comment that he didn't know much about cooperating and working with the Army, but he was nothing but a damned good raider. But he was a good raider, and sometimes he could thwart raids. In April and May 1863, he stops Union Colonel Abel Strait on a raid across northern Alabama that's aimed to try to capture Rome and then move on against the Western and Atlantic Railroad in Georgia. But he's going to be able to bring Strait's raid to naught. At one point, meeting with Strait, he uses again bluff and bluster, which he's done so well at so many different points, and has units that don't exist show up as couriers coming in to so-and-so Mississippi or so-and-so Tennessee or whatever. It didn't matter. They didn't exist. And he tells them in feigned frustration to stay out of his way. He's already got enough men at the front. And he's only has 2 artillery pieces, but he's brought in multiple teams to help move those pieces. And they swap out the teams and make it appear as if there's more artillery available. And Strait says, "Name of God, how many guns have you got?" And Forrest says reckons he's got enough, and ends up convincing Strait to surrender. And of course, Strait was furious when he figured out that Forrest had bluffed him into surrender. He's involved in other operations. He will be at Chickamauga. One of the lead confrontations will take place between Forrest and the federal forces there. He's also going to, of course, be involved in 1864 in a large number of operations, and probably his most famous series of operations. A running battle at Okolona, the capture of Fort Pillow, which we'll come back to in just a minute. Then in June, his biggest and best victory is at Bryce's Crossroads, where he takes on Sam Sturgis and defeats Sturgis and Ben Grierson, the man who had been the raider that crossed the entire length of Mississippi to get to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Of course, the movie The Horse Soldiers is very loosely built on that, with John Wayne as the Grierson figure. But Forrest is able to overwhelm Grierson's cavalry at Bryce's Crossroads. The infantry comes rushing up. It's at some distance back at Stubbs Plantation, and when it gets there, it's hot, it's humid, the troops are blown, winded, and the fight becomes fairly quickly one that Forrest is able to manipulate successfully. So he wins by, as he would say, hit them on the ends, and in this case he does the classic double envelopment of hitting them on both ends and creating a pressure that ends up causing the Federals to give way, and then he pursues them for a period of time as they retreat back toward Memphis. Another famous engagement for him is a raid against Memphis as the Federals are pushing into Alabama, and he's trying to do something to thwart that, to stop that, and he raids Memphis and convinces the Federals to drop back. In between those two, the Bryce's Crossroads and Memphis raid, a not such a good performance at Tupelo or Harrisburg, where he has a setback that again he holds to the responsibility of Stephen D. Lee. Stephen D.L. Lee is his commander, and he is again going to say that those individuals, Wheeler and Van Dorn and Stephen Lee, have been the ones that have been responsible for less than a stellar outcome as far as Forrest is concerned. Forrest will then be engaged in Hood's. Well, I guess the next big thing is the raid he makes against first of all against the railroads, but then ultimately the Johnsonville raid. And Johnsonville raid is a very colorful raid where he takes a force, captures some gunboats, actually has quite an interesting little sub-history of naval warfare, for riverine warfare for a very brief period of time. But at the end of the day, the big effort is against the big supply depot at Johnsonville, Tennessee, which he decimates and not only destroys the warehouses and the stored munitions and stored equipment, including alcohol, which catches fire and runs down to the river, Tennessee River, in sheets of flame, but also steamboats, wharfing. I mean, kind of all sorts of damage that he does as his artillery fires across with his young artillerist that he had so much faith in, a man by the name of John Morton. He had a Captain Freeman that he really thought highly of, but Freeman had died in one of the raids because he was captured and couldn't run fast enough, so the captors shot Captain Freeman down, and this young Morton ends up being the new Freeman for Forrest, and ends up doing a very fine job with him. They work well together. And it's one time at one point in the Johnsonville adventure, Forrest looks at Morton and says, "John, if they gave you enough, if me enough men and you enough guns, we could whip this war." And Forrest was just kind of had that sense of confidence and sense of success in his belief in his own ability to achieve success that plays itself out. In 1864, at the end, he's involved in Hood's move into Tennessee after the fall of Atlanta, and will be at Columbia, and then at Spring Hill, where he is part of an attempt to try to stop John Schofield from getting back to Nashville and join with George Thomas. And unfortunately, that missed opportunity is part of what Hood holds his forces responsible for occurring, and then tries to sort of, I don't know if the term punish is the best term, but I guess it's as good a term as any, punish them for that missed opportunity by a massive assault against the Union works at Franklin, Tennessee, which cost the numbers of a number of prominent Confederate generals and, of course, large numbers of troops. One of the men that falls at Franklin had been with Forrest at Spring Hill. His name was Patrick Claiborne. We've talked about him before. But Forrest will then go on to push James Harrison Wilson completely out of the picture, and ends up going to Murfreesboro again as part of Hood's attempt to figure out how to hold his position in Middle Tennessee against George Thomas. And of course, Thomas is trying to gather as many troops and get himself in the best position possible to succeed. And Forrest is detached to Murfreesboro at the largest infrastructure there, a series of fortifications called Fortress Rosecrans, and a number of Union troops there will really prevent Forrest from doing much of any damage against that facility. In fact, he's actually driven at one point away from it with some of the infantry that he'd been given as part of that operation, panicking and breaking, and Forrest having to try to figure out how to rally those men from their retreat, their precipitate flight, as they like to say. So Forrest will end up being part of the rear guard as Hood is driven from Nashville a couple of days in December, that George Thomas becomes the sledge of Nashville and drives Hood away from the environs of the city, and then Forrest is part of the sort of rear guard operation to try to slow any attempt to crush the remnants of Hood's army as it retreats and tries to get across Tennessee to a position of safety. Hood will eventually master that, Forrest helping to slow it down by leapfrogging his command. He'll set up a defensive position with another that he can fall back to, and then take the next position behind it to be ready to go to that position when that secondary line fails or is compromised. He can retreat and then continue to do that sort of leapfrog fashion, and ultimately enables Hood to survive, at least with a remnant of his forces, to live to fight another day. Of course, toward the end of the war, the Army of Tennessee ends up in the Carolinas under Joe Johnston, who had been relieved of command in the Atlanta campaign to give Hood a chance to see what he could do. And Hood had really pushed hard for victories at Peachtree Creek, at Bald Hill or Atlanta itself, at Ezra Church, and then finally defeated badly at Jonesboro, which is what caused Hood to have to retreat from or evacuate Atlanta. But anyway, back to the story. Of course, Forrest then goes into 1865. By this point, he is going to rise to the rank of lieutenant general in charge of the cavalry in the region, and then face a revamped, massive force that James Harrison Wilson has assembled, with the attempt to do to Forrest what Forrest would have done to him if the situation had been reversed. He keeps Forrest's dispersed command from being able to unite. Again, Forrest typically liked to put troops out at various points and then concentrate them when he could to face the opponent. And that's not going to be able to be possible. And Forrest is going to have a attempt at holding on to Selma, Alabama, which is going to fail, and Forrest is going to be forced to retreat, ultimately westward to Gainesville, Alabama, where he will surrender his forces in May. I mentioned Fort Pillow. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the fighting at Fort Pillow is too long for this podcast. Maybe it's worthy of another podcast, separate podcast, and we'll talk about that. But Forrest, my argument would be, lost control of the battle as opposed to conducting a deliberate campaign to annihilate the garrison. It is made up of Tennessee Unionists and former slaves, roughly half and half, and neither one of those groups would have been the kind of groups that Forrest's Confederates would have much mercy on if the circumstances allowed. And in many ways, the way that the battle ended up being conducted, Forrest really was not in a position to control what happened as much as he would like to think he was. And by the time that fighting is over, large numbers of troops have been, of Union troops have been killed who should have been spared, who should have been allowed to surrender. Some cases shot down, some cases not given the opportunity to regroup. Forrest always understood the principle that a defeated foe was as dangerous if they rallied as they were when you first confronted them, because, of course, as you assaulted, your own unit cohesion breaks down. You take on leadership losses and numbers of troops struck down, and so because of that, even a victorious force can become vulnerable. And if an enemy can rally, the enemy can end up driving the victorious force and defeating the victorious force and winning the day. So if you look at, for instance, Shiloh at Grant, you lose day one, you win day two, and you can go through a number of places where that occurs. And Forrest, a colorful way of saying that was, you put the skier in them and keep the skier in them. So one of the things you try to do was to defeat an enemy and then not let them have the chance to rally, which he was able to accomplish at Bryce's Crossroads. So that ends up being a black mark on Forrest's wartime career, the massacre at Fort Pillow, which also occurs during an election year. 1864 is a presidential election year, and it becomes fodder for a number of individuals who are trying to continue to rally people to support the administration and support the war effort. Forrest has a lot of other elements to his life that are fascinating, but I think that gives you at least a little bit of a hint. He will live until 1877, so he doesn't live substantially into the post-war period. He does live through the period of Reconstruction, but he'll die in Memphis on October 29th, 1877. From an illness that's difficult to diagnose, there are a number of people who have suggested different things. That his biggest issue was that he could not sustain weight. So even if he ate, and he ate a special diet, he could not find a way for that nutrition to keep him in good health. He basically continued to deteriorate, and it more or less passed through his system to the point that he was almost skeletal by the time he reached the end. So, it was a number of individuals who saw him right at the end barely recognized a man who'd been so full of vigor and so full of life just a few years before, and certainly during the war. So that's Nathan Bedford Forrest's military career, with a little hint of his before and a little bit of his after in civilian life. We'll talk again, but thank you so much for being with us on Reflections with Brian Steele Wills. And again, if you're interested in a book on General Forrest or on any of the other things I've written, we have our store that you can consult, and we'll try to send you a book if you're interested in having it inscribed or otherwise dedicated to someone. We can take care of that. But for now, we'll see you, and hopefully join us again on another podcast.